Commander Park Hyun shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the massive holographic display flickered in front of him. The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with nervous energy, filled with representatives from hundreds of different alien species. But today, nobody was talking about trade agreements or border disputes. Today, they were all staring at the same terrifying image floating above their heads. 3 red dots marked the latest star systems to go completely silent. No distress calls. No evacuation signals. No final messages. Just nothing. One moment these worlds were home to billions of living beings, and the next moment they simply disappeared from all communications. Park Hyun had been in the military for 20 years, but he'd never seen anything like this. The worst part wasn't just that these worlds had gone quiet. It was what the last scouting ships had found before they too vanished. Massive crystalline structures, each one the size of a small moon, had somehow appeared around these planets. They looked like enormous geometric crystals, but they pulsed, with an energy that made even the most advanced alien sensors go crazy. These things were literally eating entire worlds, turning rock and metal and living creatures into some kind of power source that nobody could understand. Elder Thalmon, the ancient representative of the Zephyrian Confederacy, suddenly spoke up from his floating platform. His voice, which usually sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, now trembled with fear. The Zephyrians were one of the oldest species in the galaxy, with memories that stretched back millions of years. If they were scared, everyone should be terrified. "The Void Devourers," he whispered, and the entire chamber fell dead silent. The old warnings were true. Park Hyun felt his blood turn cold. Every species in the galaxy had heard the ancient stories, the legends passed down from the very first spacefaring civilizations. Tales of creatures that came from the darkness between galaxies, beings that consumed everything in their path and left nothing but empty space behind. Most people thought these were just scary stories told to children, like monsters under the bed. But now, looking at those red dots on the display, Park Hyun realized the monsters were very real. The chamber erupted into chaos. Representatives began shouting in dozens of different languages, their universal translators struggling to keep up with the panic. The proud Cortani, who controlled the most advanced fleet in the galaxy, were already pulling up defensive maps of their core worlds. The insect-like hivelings started making clicking sounds that their translators couldn't even process. Even the normally calm ethereals were flickering in and out of visibility, a sure sign they were terrified. "Order, order!" shouted the council speaker, banging his energy gavel. But nobody was listening anymore. Park Hyun watched as species after species began activating their emergency protocols. Fleet admirals were being contacted, evacuation plans were being discussed. And every single conversation centered around the same idea: retreat. The Nexari delegate, a tall blue creature with too many arms, stepped forward to address the chamber. "Fellow council members," he said in his perfectly logical tone, "we must face the mathematical reality of our situation. These void devourers have consumed 3 star systems in less than 2 weeks. Their technology is clearly superior to ours. Any attempt to engage them in direct combat would result in unnecessary casualties." Murmurs of agreement spread through the chamber. The Aquatic Confederation nodded their massive heads. The Silicon Valley Coalition's robotic representatives calculated probability matrices that all pointed to the same conclusion. Even the warrior-like Predator Guild seemed ready to back down from this fight. "The only logical response," the Nexari continued, "is strategic withdrawal to defensible positions. We must consolidate our forces around the galactic core and establish a perimeter that we can actually hold." Park Hyun felt sick to his stomach. These aliens were talking about abandoning entire sectors of the galaxy. Billions and billions of innocent people would be left behind to face these monsters alone. The Outer Rim territories, where most of the younger species lived, would become a sacrifice to buy time for the more established civilizations. As the debate continued, Park Hyun pulled up his own datapad and started reading reports from human colonies in the Outer Rim, New Sol with its 30 million inhabitants, Terra Nova where his own sister lived with her family, Mining Station Echo 7, where thousands of workers extracted resources to keep Earth's economy running. All of these places would be abandoned if the Council voted for retreat. The voting began, and Park Hyun watched in horror as species after species chose to run away. The mighty Zephyrians voted to withdraw. The advanced Cortani voted to consolidate. Even the brave warrior races decided that discretion was the better part of valor. One by one, humanity's allies in the galaxy turned their backs on the people who needed help the most. Finally, it was humanity's turn to vote. The entire chamber turned to look at Park Hyun, waiting to see if the youngest species in the Galactic Council would follow the example of their elders. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of billions of lives on his shoulders, and spoke words that would change the course of galactic history forever. Captain Lee Min couldn't believe what she was reading on her screen. The evacuation orders kept coming in one after another, each one more desperate than the last. Her destroyer, the Soul's Pride, was just one ship among Earth's small fleet, but the numbers on her display were staggering. 3 billion humans were scattered across the Outer Rim colonies, living on mining worlds, research stations, and frontier settlements that most people back on Earth had never even heard of. But it wasn't just humans who were in danger. As Lee Min scrolled through the reports, she saw the real horror of what was happening. The same alien governments that had voted to retreat in the Galactic Council were now abandoning their own people. Entire populations were being left behind, like they were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Lieutenant Kim Do, her communications officer, looked up from his station with disgust written all over his face. "Ma'am," he said, trying to keep his voice professional, "the Zephyrian evacuation fleet just jumped to hyperspace. They left behind approximately 40 million of their own people on the mining worlds." Lee Min felt her stomach drop. 40 million. Zephyrians abandoned by their own government. These weren't soldiers or volunteers who had chosen to stay behind. These were ordinary families, workers, children who went to school just like human kids back on Earth. And their own people had decided they weren't worth saving. "What about the Cortani?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Same story, Captain. Their military fleet pulled out 6 hours ago, left behind every civilian colony in sectors 7 through 12. We're talking about maybe 60 million people just forgotten." The bridge of the Soul's Pride fell silent, except for the quiet hum of computers and life support systems. Lee Min's crew had served together for 3 years, through pirate raids and border skirmishes, but none of them had ever faced anything like this. They were looking at the biggest humanitarian disaster in galactic history, and apparently nobody, except humanity, cared enough to do anything about it. Admiral Choi Sung's voice suddenly crackled over the communication system from Earth Fleet Command. His voice sounded tired, like he'd aged 10 years in the past few days. "All ships, this is Admiral Choi. I'm broadcasting to every human vessel in the fleet, from our biggest battleships to our smallest scout ships." Lee Min straightened up and listened carefully. Admiral Choi had been her mentor when she was just a junior officer, and she'd never heard him sound so serious. "The Galactic Council has officially declared the Outer Rim strategically unviable," the Admiral continued. "Every other species has withdrawn their forces. As of this moment, humanity stands alone." The words hit the bridge crew like a physical blow. They all knew this was coming, but hearing it officially made it real. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations, species with technology that made human ships look like toys, had all decided to run away. And they were leaving billions of innocent people to die. Lee Min walked over to the tactical display, where red dots showed the advancing Void Devourer constructs moving through the Tau sector like a plague. Each dot represented one of those massive crystalline structures that could consume an entire planet. And they were moving fast, faster than anyone had expected. The creatures seemed to be learning, adapting, getting better at their terrible job of turning living worlds into empty space. "Ma'am," said Lieutenant Park Jun from the navigation station, "at their current rate of advance, they'll reach the colony worlds in the Kepler system within 72 hours. Lee Min knew Kepler well. It was home to New Busan, one of humanity's most successful colonies with 8 million people. There were also 3 Zephyrian research stations and a massive Cortani industrial complex. All of those people were now Sitting ducks waiting for death to arrive from space. What are our orders, Captain? Asked Kim Do quietly. Li Min looked around at her crew. These were good people, the kind of men and women who had joined Earth's space fleet because they wanted to explore the stars and protect humanity's future among the galaxies. They hadn't signed up to fight, an impossible war against monsters from ancient nightmares. But here they were, and somebody had to make a choice. Admiral Choi's voice came through the speakers again, answering the question that was on everyone's mind. Our orders are simple, people. We go get our people, all of them, and anyone else who needs help. The Admiral paused, and Li Min could almost picture him standing in Earth Fleet Command, looking out at the stars and making the hardest decision of his career. I know what the odds are, he continued. I know what we're up against, but I also know who we are. We're humans. We don't abandon our own, and we don't abandon people who need our help, even if their own governments have given up on them. Li Min felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. They were about to go up against an enemy that had sent the galaxy's mightiest civilizations running for cover. Earth's fleet was tiny compared to what the Cortani or Zephyrians could field. Their weapons were primitive, their ships were small, and they were vastly outnumbered. But they were going anyway. Helm, Li Min ordered, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. Set course for the Outer Rim colonies, maximum speed. Yes, ma'am, came the reply. As the Soul's Pride turned toward the darkness, Li Min knew they were probably flying toward their deaths. But they were also flying toward something more important than their own lives. They were flying toward the chance to prove that some things in the universe were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. Engineer Han Sol wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stepped back to admire her work. The cargo hauler Daegu Runner looked nothing like the peaceful freight ship it had been just 2 weeks ago. Where once there had been smooth hull plating designed for efficient cargo transport, now there were ugly metal bumps and welded attachments bristling from every surface. Rail guns that had been ripped out of decommissioned military vessels were bolted to the sides. Missile pods salvaged from destroyed fighters were strapped to the undercarriage. Even the cargo bay doors had been reinforced with armor plating, torn from wrecked destroyers. Captain Park Ji walked beside her through the crowded hangar bay, stepping carefully around piles of salvaged equipment and exhausted repair crews. The Ice hangar buzzed with constant activity as engineers, mechanics, and volunteers worked around the clock to turn every available ship into a weapon of war. Nobody was sleeping much these days. There simply wasn't time. It's not pretty, Han Sol admitted, gesturing at the transformed freighter. But it'll fight. The energy weapons don't work against these things. She picked up a twisted piece of metal from a nearby workbench, the remains of a laser cannon that had been fired at a Void Devourer scout. See this? This weapon could cut through a battleship's armor like it was paper, but when we hit one of those crystalline monsters, the beam just disappeared, like the creature was a black hole. For energy. Park Ji nodded grimly. They'd learned this lesson the hard way during their first encounter with the Void Devourers near the Proxima colonies. 3 human destroyers had opened fire with everything they had, pouring enough concentrated energy to level a small city into one of the crystalline constructs. The creature had absorbed every shot without even slowing down, then proceeded to tear the ships apart with beams of pure destruction. But kinetic impacts can crack their shells, Han Sol continued, pointing to the railguns mounted on the Daegu Runner. Good old-fashioned chunks of metal moving really, really fast. It's like they're designed to absorb energy weapons, but nobody taught them how to deal with getting hit by a freight train. The hangar shook slightly as another ship docked with their makeshift fleet base. Through the transparent aluminum windows, Park Ji could see the battered hull of the transport Ulsan Hope, limping home from another rescue mission. Scorch marks covered its sides, and one of its engine nacelles was completely gone. But the important thing was that it was still flying, and more importantly, it was full of refugees. The evacuation had turned into something nobody had planned for, a running battle across half the galaxy. Human ships would jump into threatened star systems, land on whatever worlds they could reach, and start loading people as fast as possible. It didn't matter if they were human colonists, abandoned Zephyrian families, or Cortani workers whose own government had written them off as acceptable losses. If someone needed help, the human fleet would try to save them. But the Void Devourers weren't sitting still. They were learning, adapting, getting smarter with every encounter. At first, they had sent single scouts to investigate human activity. Now they were dispatching hunting packs of 3 or 4 constructs, working together like wolves to corner and destroy the rescue ships. "We've saved 6 million people so far," Han Sol said, checking her tablet for the latest numbers. 6 million. Souls who would have been consumed if we hadn't shown up. But it's costing us. As if to emphasize her point, Lieutenant Nam Su's fighter squadron came screaming past the hangar entrance, their engines howling as they decelerated from combat speed. Park Ji counted the returning fighters automatically, a habit from his years as a military officer. 12 had gone out on the intercept mission. Only 6 were coming back. Nam Su himself climbed out of his battered fighter, his flight suit torn and his face covered in soot. He'd been one of Earth's best pilots before this war started, cocky and confident with a grin that could charm anyone. Now he looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. The grin was gone, replaced by the haunted expression of someone who'd seen too many friends die. "Lost 6 good pilots today," he reported to Park Ji, his voice flat and emotionless. "They saved a transport full of refugees, but the Devourers got them in the end. Pilot Kang went down fighting, took one of those crystalline bastards with him when his ship exploded." Park Ji closed his eyes for a moment. Pilot Kang had been barely 20 years old, fresh out of the academy with dreams of exploring new worlds. Now she was gone, along with too many others. The human fleet was bleeding pilots, engineers, and ships faster than they could be replaced. "Sir," Han Sol said quietly, "the enemy is adapting faster than we are. They're sending bigger packs, coordinating their attacks better, and they're learning our tactics. That ambush at the Kepler system almost cost us 3 transports." Park Ji nodded. He'd been in that battle, watching helplessly as Void Devourer constructs had appeared from hyperspace right in the middle of their evacuation convoy. Only quick thinking and a lot of luck had gotten most of the ships out alive. "How long until the next system falls?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Han Sol checked her calculations, cross-referencing the Void Devourer's rate of advance with their remaining targets. At their current pace, they'll hit the Vega colonies in 18 hours. After that, she paused, her face pale. After that, they'll reach Kepler Junction. Everyone in the hangar bay knew what that meant. Kepler Junction was the major hyperspace, crossroads that connected the outer rim to the galactic core. If the Void Devourers took control of that system, they'd have a clear path to strike at the heart of galactic civilization. It would be game over for everyone. Park Ji looked around at the converted freighters, the exhausted crews, and the handful of real warships that made up humanity's desperate fleet. They'd accomplished the impossible already, saving millions of lives that everyone else had written off, but now they faced their greatest challenge yet. "Then we make our stand at Kepler Junction," he said simply. Admiral Choi Sung stood on the bridge of his flagship, the battleship Incheon, staring out at the largest gathering of human ships in history. But as impressive as it looked, he knew the cold reality of their situation. 200 human warships floated in formation around Kepler Junction, their hulls scarred from weeks of running battles with the Void Devourers. These weren't the pristine vessels that had left Earth's shipyards. They were battle-worn survivors, patched together with whatever parts their crews could salvage. Behind the warships came the most heartbreaking sight of all: 400 converted civilian vessels that had never been meant for war. Cargo haulers with missile pods welded to their sides. Passenger liners with their luxury compartments stripped out to make room for railguns. Even old mining ships had been pressed into service, their industrial equipment turned into improvised weapons. Each one represented ordinary people who had chosen to fight instead of flee. And stretching out behind this makeshift armada were nearly 1,000 refugee ships, transports packed with families who had lost everything, medical ships full of wounded survivors, even some alien vessels whose crews had decided to stay and fight alongside the humans rather than abandon their rescuers. It was the last remnant of the Outer Rim's population, all depending on this moment. Admiral Choi turned his attention to the tactical display, where thousands of red dots were appearing at the edge of the system. His sensor operators were calling out numbers that made his blood run cold. 3,000 Void Devourer constructs, maybe more, emerging from hyperspace in perfect formation. Each one was the size of a small moon, their crystalline surfaces pulsing with energy they had stolen from consumed worlds. The enemy ships didn't look like anything built by a living species. They were geometric impossibilities, crystal formations, that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human mind could process. Looking directly at them through the view screen made Admiral Choi's eyes water and his head spin. Reality itself seemed to bend around their alien geometries, as if the universe was trying to reject their presence. Captain Yu Min's voice crackled through the communication system from the heavy cruiser Busan. "Admiral, refugee evacuation is at 60% complete. We can have the remaining civilian ships clear of the combat zone in 2 hours. Request permission to continue extraction operations." Admiral Choi closed his eyes for a moment. 2 more hours would mean saving another 400,000 lives. Children who would grow up to see tomorrow. Families who would be reunited on safe worlds far from this battlefield. But it would also mean giving the Void Devourers time to position themselves, to coordinate their attack, to turn this system into a killing field. "Negative, Captain," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "If we don't hold this line, there won't be anywhere safe to run to." The harsh truth was that Kepler Junction was the key to everything. This star system contained the most important hyperspace crossroads in the galaxy, the intersection where dozens of major trade routes came together. If the Void Devourers captured it, they would have a direct path to strike at the galactic core, where trillions of beings lived in the false safety of their advanced civilizations. The first wave of enemy constructs began their approach, moving with a fluid grace that defied physics. They didn't fly through space so much as glide through it, leaving ripples in reality behind them, like ships moving through water. The very fabric of space-time seemed to warp around their presence, creating visual distortions that made Admiral Choi's navigation officers sick to their stomachs. Throughout the human fleet, crews were making their final preparations. On the destroyer Soul's Pride, Captain Li Min was checking her ship's nuclear charges, making sure they would detonate properly when the time came. On the converted freighter, Daegu Runner, engineer Han Sol was giving her improvised weapons one last inspection, knowing that every shot would have to count. Fighter pilot Lieutenant Nam Su sat in his cockpit, going through his pre-flight checklist for what he knew would be his final mission. Around him, the few remaining pilots from his squadron were doing the same. They'd started this war with over 100 pilots. Now they were down to 15, but those 15 were ready to make the enemy pay for every meter of space. Admiral Choi opened a fleet-wide communication channel, his voice reaching every ship in the human armada. "All ships, this is Admiral Choi. In a few minutes, we're going to face an enemy that has consumed entire star systems, an enemy that sent the galaxy's most advanced civilizations running in terror." He paused, looking out at the approaching wall of crystalline death. "But we're still here, we're still fighting, not because we think we can win, but because we know what happens if we lose. Behind us are millions of innocent people who are counting on us to give them just a little more time, just a little more hope." The Void Devourer constructs were close enough now that their energy signatures were overwhelming the human sensors. The bridge lights flickered as electromagnetic pulses washed over the fleet. In the distance, space itself seemed to be catching fire as the enemy weapons began to charge. "We stand here today not just for humanity, but for every species in this galaxy," Admiral Choi continued. "For every child who deserves to see tomorrow. For every family that deserves to stay together. For everyone who believes that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible." The first Void Devourer weapons fired. Beams of pure destruction that could vaporize a battleship in seconds. But the human fleet was already moving, spreading out into attack formation, every ship racing toward an enemy that vastly outgunned and outnumbered them. "This is our moment," Admiral Choi said as the Incheon shuddered under enemy fire. "This is our stand. All ships, Engage at will. Show them what humanity is made of. The Battle of Kepler Junction had begun, and with it, the galaxy's last hope for survival. The Soul's Pride shook violently as another energy beam tore through her port side, sending sparks flying across the bridge. Captain Li Min gripped her command chair as the lights flickered and the artificial gravity wavered. Damage reports flooded in from every section of the ship. Hull breaches on decks 4, 7, and 9. Life support systems failing. Main engines running on backup power. Her beautiful destroyer was dying around her, but she still had one card left to play. "Helm, set ramming course for that construct," she ordered, pointing at the massive crystalline enemy ship that had been systematically tearing her fleet apart. The Void Devourer was easily 10 times the size of her destroyer, its geometric surfaces pulsing with the energy of consumed worlds. But Li Min had noticed something during the battle. When human ships had managed to physically impact the constructs, their crystalline shells cracked. They could absorb energy weapons all day long, but they weren't designed to handle a few thousand tons of metal and nuclear explosives moving at high speed. "Ma'am," her helmsman said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Ramming course laid in. We'll impact their power core in 90 seconds. Li Min activated the ship-wide communication system, her voice echoing through every corridor and compartment of the Soul's Pride. "All hands, this is the captain. Abandon ship immediately, get to the escape pods and get clear. That's an order." She expected to hear the sound of running feet, the hiss of escape pod launches, the normal chaos of a crew abandoning their dying ship. Instead, she heard something that made her heart swell with pride and break at the same time. Silence. Nobody was moving. Nobody was leaving. Lieutenant Kim Do, her communications officer, turned in his chair to face her. His uniform was torn, and there was blood on his forehead from a flying piece of debris, but his eyes were clear and determined. "With respect, Captain," he said quietly, "we're staying." Around the bridge, her crew nodded in agreement. The young ensign at the weapons station, barely out of the academy, the grizzled chief engineer who had served on this ship longer than anyone, the navigation officer who had a wife and 2 kids back on Earth. All of them were choosing to stay, choosing to see this through to the end. "You don't have to do this," Li Min said, her voice thick with emotion. "You all have families, people who are waiting for you to come home." "So do they," said the chief engineer, pointing at the tactical display where hundreds of refugee transports were still trying to escape the battle zone. "Those people down there have families too, and if we don't stop this thing, none of us are going home anyway." Across the battlefield, similar scenes were playing out on dozens of human ships. The converted freighter, Mokpo, had lost its engines and was drifting helplessly toward a Void Devourer construct. Instead of waiting to be destroyed, her captain made a desperate choice. The Mokpo had been carrying mining explosives when the war started, and those charges were still in her cargo bay. "This is Captain Seo of the Mokpo," came the voice over the fleet communication channel. "We're going to ram their core. Tell my wife I love her." The freighter's cargo bay doors opened, and Captain Seo fired every thruster his ship had, accelerating, directly into the heart of the crystalline construct. The explosion when the mining charges detonated was visible from across the star system, a brilliant flash that cracked the Void Devourer's shell and sent fragments of alien crystal spinning into space. In the fighter squadrons, Lieutenant Nam Su was having his own moment of truth. His fighter had taken a direct hit from an enemy beam, and his life support was failing. He could eject, try to reach one of the rescue ships that were still operating in the combat zone, or he could make his death count for something. Below him, he could see an evacuation transport packed with refugee families, trying desperately to reach the edge of the system. A Void Devourer scout was closing in on the defenseless ship, its weapons charging for a killing blow. Nam Su made his choice. "This is Lieutenant Nam Su to all fighters," he said over the radio, his voice calm despite the pain from his injuries. "I'm going to clear a path for that transport. Cover the evacuation ships, get them out of here." He pushed his damaged fighter to maximum speed, diving straight toward the Void Devourer's power matrix. The enemy construct tried to swat him away with a beam weapon, but Nam Su was too close, moving too fast. His fighter smashed into the alien ship's energy core, and the resulting explosion bought the transport precious seconds to escape. All across the battlefield, human crews were making the same impossible choice. Ships that couldn't fight anymore became weapons themselves. Damaged fighters flew suicide runs to protect evacuation transports. Even civilian vessels, crewed by refugees who had already lost everything, turned back to help with the battle. The tide began to turn not because of superior technology or brilliant tactics, but because of something the galaxy had forgotten. The willingness to sacrifice everything for people you'd never met. The courage to stand up to monsters when everyone else had run away. The simple human belief that some things were worth dying for. Admiral Choi, watching from the bridge of the Finchon, saw his tactical display change as one by one, the Void Devourer constructs began to fall. Not destroyed by overwhelming firepower, but cracked open by the desperate courage of ordinary people who refused to give up. When the Soul's Pride finally struck her target, the explosion lit up the entire system. Captain Li Min and her crew were gone, but their sacrifice had destroyed one of the enemy's largest constructs, and across the galaxy, other species who had been watching the battle in shame began to realize what they had witnessed. Humanity had done the impossible. They had stood against the darkness and won, not through strength or technology, but through something far more powerful. They had shown the galaxy what it meant to never abandon hope, no matter how desperate things seemed, the surviving void. Devourer constructs, damaged and confused by tactics they couldn't understand, began to retreat into the darkness between galaxies. The immediate threat was over, but the memory of what humanity had done would echo through the stars forever.